They call out the anarcho-communism Facebook group for being a dumpster fire and full of racists and reactionaries in the first few minutes of this. Are they talking about this group? Because it doesn't seem that way to me. Yeah, we're talking about this group.
We're talking about that group. We're definitely talking about the group that you posted that in.
Greetings, listeners, siblings, friends, comrades, workers of the world, and welcome to the second installment of Kropotse-Tung. So I'm back here with my comrade Mao Trash.
Hello, I am Mao Trash.
And yeah, we have some follow-up from last time, some feedback from various commenters. But I think we can just go through some of these arguments that people put forth against dialectics, and I have some thoughts or some questions of my own that I want to ask too. So I think the main argument that people put forth is that there's a deterministic idea to this, that socialism is the next definitive stage in history. That
yeah, no, I'll clarify that because that's it's mechanical. It is a mechanical interpretation of Marxism. Marxism is not a mechanical thing. It is something that must be interpreted. It is something that is constantly changing because the world is constantly changing and everything is always in motion. History does not move in a straight line. I would say that history moves sort of in spirals, with old society always having influence on the new society.
All right. So we wouldn't necessarily have to see socialism after capitalism.
Yeah, no, and you won't necessarily see communism after socialism because capitalist restoration happens.
Okay, so yeah, that does seem to make sense. So that's kind of the idea that I think a lot of people have about dialectics, that it is a very deterministic mechanical thing.
Yeah, so it doesn't work like an equation that you can and get the same result out each time. Another thing that came up a lot was that that there's agency of human beings, and yeah, that's obviously true. This will not it's not that we don't have any influence over history. It's actually quite contrary to that, or that yeah, so we're not saying that humans don't have any influence over history, but that the dialectical model is the best way to analyze where a lot of people are coming from and why they move forward in the ways that they do. So yeah, it's not that dialectics is not an equation that you can know what's going to happen next. In fact, this is one of the reasons why Marx never wrote about communism or socialism. The only time he ever wrote about what socialism would look like was after the Paris Commune, because that was an example of when people actually did take power and they had to some extent the ability to what would happen. But that was the only time he ever really wrote about socialism.
Right.
Because you can't really predict the future. You can only acknowledge that there are certain forces at play today that are similar to forces that are at play beforehand.
Right.
So yeah, you never really know what the future is going to look like until it happens.
And I feel in certain ways, Marxists are even more serious about this in a way, because if you think about a lot of anarchist ideologies and a lot of ideologies that are Marxist would call utopian.
Mhm.
That is like a way. It's not a way of trying to predict history or the future necessarily, but it is in a sense a way to paint up a picture of what you want and then work from like for that instead of
Yeah,
like more pragmatic.
it's not like thinking like where we want to go is based off where we are, essentially, as opposed to what a lot of utopian ideas are. Utopian ideas are just like, this is what I think would be cool. Um, dialectics doesn't just say, oh, because this is one of the comments that I saw was that someone said that I would rather my ideology be guided by like he didn't say moral, he said like it being upstanding or something like that, better ideals or something like that, rather than it just being inevitable. Yeah, we don't like think that we don't support communism because I think that communism is going to be inevitable. In fact, I don't necessarily think that. We can get into that in a little bit. But like we do think that the way that we are today, where we are today, will influence where we are going to be, and so we need to heavily analyze the society in which we live in today as a guiding force towards building what we want to build.
Yeah, and I think that's almost like inevitable. That like I think it's pretty clear, and I think most people accept that the society we have now is going to have an impact on the future society and how it work.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, so I think that's the main argument against dialectics. I have one question more about dialectics, and that's like peasants under feudalism.
Oh,
it was
yeah.
their interest to not to abolish the class system they lived under, but to move upwards on like the class ladder.
Yeah.
So why is it not considered like in the interests of the proletariat to try to reach some sort of bourgeois status?
Okay, so as I was saying, the peasants, when they get their own autonomy because they don't work in these big collective like situations, they have their own thing. They do, or their family does. It's typically their family. Individualized, even though it's their family, but it's their thing. So they have their thing that they want to own, and then they do own, and then they try their best to make what they have as their own the most do the best, which is where like this competition comes from, and this is where the petty bourgeois standpoint comes from. The reason that the proletariat doesn't have that is because they don't have that same like how do I say this? They don't have the same ownership ideas. Like on an individual level, they might everyone thinks that they're going to become the boss in the future.
Yeah.
But like they also recognize to an extent that they're not going to own their piece of the company. They're never going to own just the part that they do. And sometimes they do, like actually, like this is what happens when I'll use construction because that's the industry that I know best because that's what I do. Is that like sometimes they will actually break off and then they will form their own, like they will be contracted out by other companies to do just their job. And so that's how like they become petty bourgeois on an individual level. But they also, for the most part, recognize when they go to work that like they can't like just do their job, and like think that can be that can be a source of employment on its own without the coordination and efforts of every other worker
Right.
that are there.
Yeah.
Like their work relies on other people's work.
Yeah. So it's,
So they have a more collective viewpoint. They have, in some ways, it's more individual because they don't have like the same family outlook, and so in that way, it's more individual. But as far as like society in general, like the proletarian experience lends itself to viewing life in a much more collective way.
right. Right. Okay, that makes sense. So, like, I see it as maybe like there are two aspects to this. There's like the peasant or the peasant family has like this feeling that they do, in a sense, own like their, even say they own like, say they work at like
They,
farm.
even if they don't own it, they recognize that they could own just the part of work that they do.
Yeah.
And it would essentially operate the same.
And I mean, like, yeah, they could like own that. Like, it's
So
like,
because they're
workers
like,
on
if you're farming on somebody else's land, like the farming is like just one job, and so it makes sense to say, hey, if I owned all this that I'm farming on, as like I'm only farming on this plot of land and I'm the only farmer there. If I own that same plot of land, my job is done the same, except I now get more of the profit because I own it. Whereas the proletariat, like, yeah, your work cannot exist if other people are there.
Yeah, and I'm just thinking like
if other people weren't there.
I'm just thinking like there's a proletarian is under no illusion that he or she or they own work. Like it is so clear that the work, the production is controlled by someone else.
And that it can't exist on its own.
Yeah.
Like that. Like
no. I'm just thinking about like another. Yeah, I agree with that. I'm just thinking like I can see another aspect here, which is like that you're under no illusion that you own it, while a peasant is like that is where you live and it is like you are the only
like you're like peasantry. I mean, peasantry and feudalism works different case to case, but for a lot of them, they were in debt. They were in perpetual debt to the land that they owned. I think this was main model. And some parts of Europe and China, this was basically the model where they would pay rent, and part of their harvest would be their rent, but they would never actually be able to produce enough to completely pay off their rent, so they'd be in debt. But every now and then, like there would be a peasant who would be able to pay off their debt, and then once that happened, they would sometimes be in a position where they would be able to buy land, and that's where they got that's where you get the middle peasantry in some cases, where like the peasantry actually does own their means of work. They own that plot of land.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's not something that will ever exist for a proletarian. A proletarian will never be able to just own their part of their work without like becoming petty bourgeois, but that can't exist on like a 100% scale.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. So yeah, let's maybe go. We talked a little bit about like the anarchists' method of analyzing stuff. So go into that a bit. I saw some questions. I saw first the Red and Black Revolutionary was very helpful to point out that there are in fact two separate methods of analysis within anarchism. Yes. One formulated by Noam Chomsky, which is, I think, by more well-read anarchists considered to be not as good. That's the one with, like, we talked about in the last episodes, that a hierarchy needs to be justified
by the people below it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Where we pointed out that like there are no metrics by which you can do this. So I think at first we had some people, or like at least one person, argue that like from that standpoint, and what they have said is justification for a hierarchy is whether or not it is emancipatory to human condition. For example, authority of a doctor. And then I asked this person to elaborate on what emancipatory to the human condition means, and they said if it makes your life easier without taking away your autonomy, it is emancipatory. It increases possibilities of possibility. It increases the possibility that one may choose to shape their own life. A doctor fixes you so you can walk again. This is justified. State gives you free education, but you can only use your education in specific areas of capitalist workplace. So that's not justified. So, just like spontaneous ideas on that.
Yeah. So this isn't too far off from like dialectic. Basically, the dialectical model for this, if you're gonna use the doctor example, is basically that there isn't a contradiction between. I mean, there are contradictions and everything, but there's no contradiction between a doctor and a patient because they both basically have the same interests: fix the person.
Yeah.
And so it's not about whether or not there's authority. It's whether or not there are opposing interests for dialectics. That is the dialectical model.
And yeah, just like my idea was this, the justification given here, or the metrics of justification given, I think they're still vague. I think they're still not really saying much. I think something being emancipatory to the human condition is like, it's a lot of words that can mean a lot of things.
Yeah, I mean, but all things have to be interpreted. Dialectics is the same way. Like everything must be interpreted,
right.
And there are going to be disagreements when interpretation happens. Like this, yeah.
But yeah,
always something that has so many different factors that must be discussed before, like any consolidated position is made.
Yeah. So then the Red and Black Revolutionary explained the other method of analysis, which was, I guess, a more classical understanding that you should try to, an anarchist should try to look for and identify power structure, systems of oppressive power. And then we know, he also said that we know that a system is oppressive if it is a social system in which power is allocated to a minority over a majority, and this limits the social influence, visibility, and overall control of the majority. Do you have anything against that?
Not in particular. Like I would say that is a better method of analysis, but I also think that it's in many ways closer to dialectics, because like with the dialectical model, we don't identify whether or not something is oppressive. We identify whether or not it is. I mean, we do, but we more so identify whether or not there is a conflict of interest, which all oppression does have conflict of interest. All oppression does.
Right.
So yeah, that's basically my 2 cents as far as
and
that
I think
goes.
also like that it could be more useful to look at conflict of interest, because I think even here, like I do prefer this because it is more clear and it's more easy to understand. but it's still like it's like specifically allocating power, or like in this case you have to be a minority in order to be like oppressive.
Uh-huh.
I don't think this necessarily works if you're talking about, say, racism in America.
Yeah. Or like,
Or
especially in the context of like
xenophobia.
settler, um, especially in the context of settlers,
Yeah,
because like at certain times that is the case. Like in South Africa, the Africans were significantly more populous than the white settlers, but like today in the U.S. ain't a whole lot of natives in
yeah,
comparison to how many white people there are. So I would generally say that that's kind of where things can sometimes veer into populism, which is so that can sometimes veer into populism. So and like I know Red and Black Revolutionary enough to know that they would never like actually say that that it's justified, that like settler
yeah. No,
ideology
obviously.
is justified because they're the majority, but because of conflict of interest, yeah, natives don't really like natives can't really coexist peacefully with a settler occupying force.
Yeah,
Fucking white
yeah,
people.
definitely. And like this, obviously we don't believe that uh, the Red and Black Revolutionary actually like thinks that this can justify settler ideology, but like the the this system of analysis kind of does justify it in a way, or at least doesn't say that it's an oppressive system we necessarily ought to bring down. So like it's just about like that the analysis itself is kind of lacking, basically.
Hmm.
Um, someone here, it's just a new topic here. Someone asked, why Maoism, and why have I brought on a Maoist instead of some sect
Instead,
of libertarian Marxism?
oh, so not why Maoism, but why did you choose a Maoist? Okay.
I guess.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like obviously as Maoist, I think that the Maoist interpretation of Marxist philosophy is the most accurate for it being applied to the modern situation. Um, as for why has chosen me, I think is mostly because of two things. One, the relationship between Maoists and anarchists. A lot of anarchists don't like to admit this, at least a lot of anarchists in cities or places that don't have a whole lot of Maoists. But in cities where there are Maoists and anarchists, really, like, Maoists will get along with anarchists better than, like, tankies. Get along with anarchists better than we get along with tankies, and anarchists certainly get along with us better than they get along with like traditional Marxist-Leninists. So I think that the fact that we have that relationship, which we can, I think in a bit I'll explain why I think that there is that relationship, but because of that, a lot of the Marxist influence that anarchism has is kind of similar to it is in many ways similar to the anarchist or the Maoist analysis because of the influence there. Another comment that I saw that kind of relates to that was like, well, actually, Marxists ought to accept more of anarchism and slave. And I wouldn't say that. I would say that this developed independent of anarchism, but I do think that Marxism, while it sort of peered further away from anarchism at a certain point, Maoism, I think, in some ways represents a trend that it's becoming a little bit more similar towards anarchism, particularly with things like Cultural Revolution, mass line, which is basically that we don't ever trust that like people in positions of authority are just gonna always be cool and dandy because of their class character or something like that. We think that like because all things are in motion, their class character can change, which is how capitalist restoration happens. And that it is the duty of the masses of people, not anyone in a position of power, to constantly identify and uproot these problems. I mean, we think that it's the duty of the party to like lead and educate the masses to the point where they can do this, to the point where it like makes enough sense that like the masses of people have the ability to recognize trends instead of just like being under the influence, unchangingly being under the influence of authority. So like, yeah, anarchists and Maoists, anarchists and Maoists get along generally. Not on the internet, but like in IRL, ask any Maoist organizer in the United States, and they will probably tell you that they, one, used to be an anarchist, and two, trust anarchists more than anyone else. So that's, I would say, part of why when anarchists want to understand Marxism, a lot of the time they go to Maoists.
Yeah, there's a surprising amount of there's a surprising amount of anarchists who have become Maoists or ex-anarchists.
I was an anarchist about 2 years ago.
Yeah, so it's that was like mainly the thing I think that Maoism or like modern day Maoism has some of like some what you really sloppily could call libertarian tendencies.
I would say that that's a sloppy way of saying it, but I wouldn't say that it's entirely untrue.
It's like libertarian,
because of our analysis of what authority is and shit like that, we would say that like shit like that is actually way more authoritarian, but it's also more similar to anarchism. I would say that like Cultural Revolution and constantly like questioning people in positions of power and constantly like uprooting that, I think that that's authoritarian as fuck, because like what it is it's the masses of people constantly pushing their authority on any bourgeois ideology that ever like dares to rear its head. It's like we absolutely want that at any point that bourgeois ideology and bourgeois tendencies arise, that they be fucking smashed by the masses of people. And so we basically see that the masses of people are going to be the authoritarians, not like a small group of people being the authoritarians.
It's so, like
but that's also like the difference between anarchists and Marxists, is that like anarchists wouldn't necessarily see the masses of people projecting their authority on people in positions of power as being authoritarian. They'd see it as liberatory, which it is liberatory, but because of that, they wouldn't see it as being authoritarian.
I think talking in terms of authority is somewhat it makes the discussion more confusing, I think, to a lot of people. And I would probably talk more like in terms of like, well, you can talk in terms of like class interests, but you can also talk in terms of like autocracy and stuff.
Oh, word.
So I would say like that. Maybe what's the opposite of autocratic? Democratic?
I suppose.
Yeah, it's in a way a sort of democratic authority, I guess.
Yeah. We Maoists would call it pro-people. That mostly comes out of like the Philippines, because there's a Maoist struggle going on in the Philippines, and when they refer to like proletarian and like libertarian or liberatory politics, they refer to it as pro-people. And so like Maoists around the world have sort of taken that on, is when we say stuff like that, we call it pro-people. Yeah.
All right. Do we have any more follow-up?
Not that I can think of at the moment.
Yeah, we don't have to look at the arguments made in the anarcho-communism group. That's some dumb shit. Okay, so you want to go over base and superstructure real quick?
Okay, so base and superstructure is a Marxist thing. What this essentially means is that there is a base to the way that certain functionings of society work, and the superstructure exists to support this base, which kind of doesn't really make a sometime. Okay, so the superstructure can exist without the base, but the superstructure also exists to maintain the base. So it doesn't really make sense, because a base is supposed to be something that can exist by itself and supports everything above it. So in some ways it's poor wording, but the base is generally the economic model, because that is where people's interests mostly come from. There are other aspects, but generally their interests come from these things. And then some people like to put on, like, when dealing with like college liberals, typically they'll put on their sociology 101 hat and say, well, you can't reduce everything down to economics or class. There's intersections and different things that are constantly at play. And it's like, yes, we recognize this. Marxists absolutely recognize this. However, in the grand scheme of things, not all of these sources are equal. And so, while they do have a relationship, so while other forms of oppression have a relationship that supports the economic model, or that are in the interest of the economic model, the economic model also influences other forms of oppression. Oftentimes we would say more so. So what this means is that, for example, imperialism. Imperialism doesn't exist just like, as much as I hate white people, it doesn't exist just because white people are mean. Capitalism developed in Europe, and because of the way that capitalism works, they had to constantly grow. There are about five main aspects of imperialism, which I won't go over. But essentially, the way that capitalism works, eventually over time, it must expand into two other places, and this is the source of imperialism. Back to superstructure. The superstructure are other forms of, or just other functionings in society that support and maintain the economic model so that it can maintain itself. These are things like the media, patriarchy, racism, behavior, education. These are all part of the superstructure. They are functions that exist mostly to support the base.
It's kind of like, this is a really bad metaphor, but it's kind of like if you have one of those like chia pits. You know, like those like dirt animals, and then you like water them. That dirt, the dirt, that's the economic base, and out of that, like it grows like a layer, like a shield defending and upholding.
Okay, yeah, thinking of it as the shield is actually a good way to think of it, because like
I was thinking like,
because like one of the problems with calling it a base is that a base can exist by itself, and like dirt can also exist by itself. But when you start to think of it as like a shield that protects it, that like sort of makes it make more sense, that like it relies upon, or if you think of it like this, like a plant nurtures, like dirt can exist on its own, but like without plants, it will not be able to get the nitrogen from the air to nurture and make the dirt fertile, I guess is a way that I could say it.
Or you could also think it like this: like you have,
but the plant couldn't exist without the dirt.
Like you have, if you have a tree,
Mhm.
and that tree grows leaves,
Yeah.
in order to sustain itself.
Yeah.
Photosynthesis, and then
yeah, like the leaves certainly can't exist without the tree, but the tree is also helped out quite a bit by the leaves.
Yeah.
I think that's an all right way to, that kind of explains the way that it works.
I'm sure
So,
we're gonna
like,
have a bunch of angry Marxists commenting that analogy was crap.
It probably is. We'll see what the comments say. But shit. Yeah, I think that that's a good way to put it. So yeah, like things like media is media and education under capitalism like exists largely to support capitalism.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Superstructure.
So what I think is interesting, or I don't know. I think what a problem here, I guess.
Okay.
Is a problem when it comes to anarchism and the is like when we're talking about intersectionality and like stuff like identity politics.
Okay. So like what Marxists think of intersectionality.
Yeah, and then you make
That's-
note of what like idpool and stuff.
Yeah, because that's something that's often misinterpreted. So Marxists will oftentimes say that they reject intersectionality, and so people will take that to think that they're like vulgar class reductionists. Essentially, what we believe when we criticize intersectionality, it's not that we don't think that different forms of oppression intersect, but that the intersectional model, and especially the trend of intersectionality within feminism, oftentimes doesn't address what causes these different forms of oppression. So it just sort of makes it seem like they exist for their own purpose. So it's not that we don't think that things intersect, but that they don't intersect like for no reason, I guess.
Yeah.
That they have a class character to them. So like it's not just that like, oh, there's a form of oppression that I have because I'm a brown person, and then there's a form of oppression that I have because I'm poor, and now I have two.
Now I have two.
No, I'm broke because I'm brown, and like I'm brown because, well, I'm not brown because I'm broke, but I'm not. I guess to quote Frantz Fanon, who wrote "Wretched of the Earth," who's probably one of the best anti-colonial theorists of the 20th century. He said, "You are rich because you are white, and you are white because you are rich." And so it's not that like it's not that I'm broke. It's not that there's that I have class oppression and I have racial oppression, but that my like racial oppression is rooted in class oppression. And so like you can't really separate class and race.
Right.
And the intersectional model often thinks that they're just two things that intersect rather than things that rely on each other.
Right. And this is obviously not to say that capitalism like created racism. That racism.
Yeah, like these things can theoretically exist without capitalism, or they can exist with, like, there are a number of different reasons why they exist. But capitalism is a big part of it. I would say the strongest part of it. And so, like, you can not have capitalism and still have these things, but you can't have them in the way that they exist now.
Right.
And so I think a pretty good way to explain like why our critical analysis of intersectionality would be something that a friend of mine said when she went to an ILPS. ILPS is International League of People Struggle. She went to a conference there, which is like an organization of various anti-imperialist organizations. She went there and like people from various organizations were talking, and she said like, I fucking love being here. One of the reasons is that we have people who are talking about queer oppression, who are talking about patriarchy, who are talking about racism, and not one person has said the word intersectionality. It's not that like, yeah, you can talk about there being various forms of oppression without having to go back to like intersectionality. Basically, the way that we see it is that like intersectionality doesn't go far enough because really any method of analysis should be inherently intersectional anyways. So like we would say that an anti-imperialist analysis, if done properly, is about as intersectional as you can get.
All right. And I think this is just like a spontaneous thought here, but one thing that kind of annoys me with especially liberal intersectional feminists is their tendency to, like when they're talking about various forms of oppression, they tend to not talk about capitalism, but rather about classism.
Yeah, they talk about classism rather than capitalism. And so like this is like they like another issue with the intersectional trend is that it views these systems of oppression as simply behavioral. They're not just behavioral. They exist with a purpose. They don't exist because people are mean.
Basically.
So yeah, they'll talk about classism as like a behavior.
Yeah.
Or and sometimes they'll talk about they'll talk about classism in terms of like actual oppressive programs, like cuts to welfare. Like they'll say, "Oh, that's classist." It's like it's capitalism, is what it is. It's
because like the capitalist system needs it to happen.
Yeah. It's not like just because they're mean to poor people. Yeah. It's because it's in their interests too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And a lot of this is like, I guess you could say intersectionality tackles or tries to tackle the symptoms, but not the disease.
Yeah. I would say that's the intersections of oppression are, I would say, the symptoms, not the disease. The
right.
Disease is class society. The disease is imperialism. It's various things.
And again, that's not to say that
they
are
can
not
exist without imperialism. Yeah.
Like
sure. But they can't exist the same way.
No, they can't exist the same way. And like, I guess this intersectional thinking, this purely intersectional thinking, might be more useful if we, like in a future where classes have been abolished, and we can no longer look to like the class contradictions as the source.
So like essentially, like when class is abolished and things like that, like remnants of old society will always remain. So, but that's when they do actually remain as behaviors.
Yeah.
So like we talk about in the communist movement, like patriarchal behaviors, like it's not that even if your politics are like feminist or stuff like that, like yeah, you're fighting technically for stuff that is liberatory, but you can still have oppressive behaviors. Like these behaviors do exist, and like they of the superstructure and the capitalist imperialist model. But like that's largely a side effect. So like even when you're fighting for liberatory things, they exist because they are lingerings of your upbringing in a capitalist society and the upbringing of the people who lived before you who are in capitalist society and things like that. So like oppressive behaviors do exist, but even when they exist, oftentimes they have a class character. But
so perhaps
yeah, so
intersectionality is an analysis for a hopefully
it's a
happier
good analysis.
and classless future.
In I would have to think about that more, but I would say that it is a good way. It is a good analysis to consider when you want to address your own behaviors. It is not necessarily a good analysis for when you want to take on emancipatory politics.
Right. Right. Yeah. That makes sense. So you talked a little bit about race and the class character, or racism and the class character of racism. Talk about like could you talk about like other oppressive structures?
So I guess patriarchy is also a pretty solid one to try and tackle. So it depends place to place.
Okay.
Where some of the sources of patriarchy comes from. In Europe, it developed from. It's been developing for a very long time, but patriarchy under capitalism stems largely from patriarchy under feudal society. It's not the same, and in fact, it's still developing, but it lingers a lot from feudalism. So basically, the way that it functions to serve the interest of capitalism is that women have historically been given the role of reproductive labor. What this means is that reproductive labor typically is housework. It is cooking and cleaning and basically making life it makes life, not a fucking mess. It makes life more comfortable, I guess. So when women aren't like, I'm using the model of like the heteronormative nuclear family. I'm aware that that men and women are not the only people in the world, but like generally, according to the patriarchal model, there's the man, the woman, there are children. Yay. So this is the model that I'm using when I explain like the patriarchal model. All right. So now that we have that understood, so the man will go to work and he does productive labor. This means that he is actually like making goods. Generally he's producing. Sometimes it's service work, but like whether they're like a factory worker or a construction worker or they're data entry or management or a number of things. It's directly what he's doing is he's like directly making growth in the economy by producing goods and services. Reproductive labor, basically, if the man has to come home and then do his own dishes and cook his own food and wash his own clothes and clean his own house, then he has less time and energy when he goes back to work, and so he becomes less productive at work, and so that job has been given to the woman. So the woman basically refreshes. The woman makes it more accessible for men to basically refresh themselves for work so that they are as productive as possible when they get back to work. So Yeah, so that's reproductive. It's like refreshing. So without, the reproductive work of the woman boosts the productivity of the man at work, and so the man gets paid directly for his work, like he gets a paycheck. The woman is paid indirectly because he lives with the man, and so the man goes to work, he gets his paycheck, he comes home, and they use his money to sustain the household, right? And so the woman is paid indirectly. The woman is paid indirectly by the employer of the man for the job of basically making it possible for his production to be boosted, to keep his level of production up. This is what this does, however, that it makes the woman subservient to the man because instead of being a worker and getting a paycheck like everyone else, her survival is based upon her ability to basically attract a man by making herself seem like she is the best at refreshing him. This is basically you'll see those fucking memes on Facebook that's men cooking because the previous generation didn't teach women shit. Women are sort of forced to make themselves the best reproductive laborers that they can in order to find a man who is willing to pay her, or through the indirect relationship between her and the employer.
Yeah.
That makes sense?
Yeah.
So
just to...
But this is a kind of a remnant from feudalism. And as capitalism develops, because it's still developing, everything's always in motion, what we are seeing is that women are entering the workforce. This is because, I feel like what I just explained there with the indirect position between the man and the employer and the woman being paid indirectly, I feel like that explains its relationship to capitalism pretty solidly. Patriarchy exists in order to boost the productivity of men who go to work. Yeah. But as we see capitalism developing, sometimes there aren't really a whole lot of people anymore who there aren't really a whole lot of households where both parents aren't working. We are getting to the point where everyone's working now. However, because there isn't that reproductive labor of the household happening anymore, exported to the market. So in order to make life convenient and in order to have the same energy and time for someone to be productive when they go back to work, they have to go to the market for these reproductive labor services. So that means that with their kids, they have to hire babysitters. They will have to go to a dry cleaners more often, or they will they'll eat fast food more often, or just go to restaurants more often, or they'll hire maids every now and then. Those are examples of reproductive labor being put onto the market.
Does that also kind of lead into the developing automation of reproductive labor?
Yes, it does, but we don't really know a whole lot about that because that is still a very new development.
Yeah.
Because women aren't in the house as much anymore to perform their reproductive labor, the market has had to provide for these reproductive labor services. However, you need workers to do those things. So who's going to fill those jobs? Well, the same people who are going to do those jobs as the people who are doing them in the household. It's going to be women. Like, who's going to, like, that's why if you go to a barber shop, instead of having your mom cut your hair, fewer women know how, because they are focused on work, because they need to make money. And like, some of them will focus a lot on cutting hair. My mom cuts hair. And so if you go into a barbershop, generally it's women cutting hair. If you go to a daycare center or you hire a babysitter, chances are it's going to be a woman. The food industry is kind of 50-50, but like, it's more than most industries. So because women were raised previously to do reproductive labor, when reproductive labor becomes marketized, they end up filling those positions. But like, they still have to have customers and shit like that. And so they must be as nice as possible to them, and they must like look presentable, and they must, they're still in the position where they are subject to like being as presentable and yada yada yada, patriarchal things. They're still under the influence of like patriarchal behaviors and expectations. So this is how capitalism develops, patriarchy develops as well.
Right. So
I mean, that's one aspect of patriarchy, but it's a very large aspect of patriarchy.
Yeah.
So a lot of this actually goes back to imperialism, and imperialism goes back to capitalism. But the reason that this goes back to imperialism is because in many other societies, like, the gender binary doesn't necessarily exist. Gender just doesn't work the same in every society. But with imperialism, Western ideas and expectations and behaviors have been forced upon the people who imperialism is most harshly affecting. So, like, I'm an indigenous person. What this means is that, like, there were indigenous people of North America, of the Western Hemisphere, had a fuck ton of gender systems, but those have been erased very intentionally through boarding schools and just ignoring them, and education that doesn't talk about these things, and particular oppression of non-binary genders and shit like that. Is that like the model that works for capitalism and imperialism has to be forced upon people who did not practice this. And so this is part of how, so there's like a lot of people who would not be living under the same patriarchal model that otherwise would be, or there is a lot of people who would not be living under the same patriarchal model that they are if it wasn't for imperialism, which is why, a large part of why, there are other reasons, but that's a large part of why patriarchy, depending on the context, can be brought back to imperialism. And the same thing with like queer oppression, is that it doesn't really fit in with the model. So cultures that have different gender and different and are more accepting towards like what we would now call queer, they have been repressed. And so even white people who are queer are still like, they still feel this form of oppression, because like they still have to follow under the model that they fit into.
Right.
That's where like queer oppression comes from. Is it comes from imperialism and further capitalism, depending on the where you are.
Right.
Yeah. So basically, we've gone over some of the responses from the last video, talked a little bit about what we will be discussing next time, and went over base and superstructure as a large part of this episode.
Yeah.
Fuck, we don't really have an outro. There's the until next time, but
Yeah, we'll have to think about that. But in the meantime, until next time.
until next time, I'm Mao Trash.
And I'm the Black Rose.